because right now we're currently in an issue about, well, agricultural reform, with Prime Minister Modi actually managing to have two bills on farm reforms actually sailed through despite a minister resigning from his cabinet. Now, of course, I know your other passion is elections. So it's interesting that even though there may be protests, there may be issues in the states and in state elections, at the center, Prime Minister Modi still seems undisputably with the political capital to encash more and more reforms like this.
Yes, so I think that theoretically, India has two things going for it in this regard. One, as you mentioned, that he still has a lot of political capital, even though he's now well into his second term, when typically political capital begins to diminish. And the second point, which I think is that if you look at India's history, we only tend to carry out economic reforms when we have our back to the wall. And this is something which, again, I explain in the book, that it's a four-stage process that most emerging markets tend to follow, which is that they reform when they have their back to the wall. That's when you end up getting an economic boom because the reforms facilitate that. And then you get complacency, which again seeds this, which again sows the seeds of a crisis, and back you get into the circle of life with a crisis. So I think that what he needs to do, which is the government and Prime Minister Modi rather, is that they need to focus a lot on the fact that we are in a crisis environment and use that to try and push through reforms, because I think that's something which he has the political capital to do so. And, we are in an exceptional situation where we need to use that situation to push through these reforms like we have done in the past when we have had our back to the wall.
Do you think, in fact, he's got the space to go much further? Because one argument would be that, in fact, we're not being reformist enough, that this is the time when we can literally reinvent everything, whether it's looking at monetizing a fiscal deficit, whether it's forgetting what a deficit, whether it's printing more currency, or even looking at dismantling various issues of how we distributed welfare so far, that maybe look at putting emergency cash into people's hands. Is this the time to be actually guns blazing on all kind of reforms you couldn't do otherwise?
Yeah, so I think we have to be careful about what we define as reforms, because some of the things that you are mentioning here are not really reforms because they are handouts. Now, you can argue that a developing country like India, we have to keep in mind the welfare and the handouts. But I think that this is where we have to learn from the other countries, which is what I mentioned in the book. There's a line from one of my favorite movies of all time, Top Gun, that I keep remembering every time I see the economic debate unfold in India. And that is that our ego keeps writing checks which our body can't cash. And so this is where I see that, we want to give this handout, or we want to give this amount of stimulus because America's done this or UK is doing that. And I just think that's all misguided. We are still a developing country. Our resources are limited. We entered this crisis with one of the worst fiscal deficits and highest public debt burdens in the world. We don't have a reserve currency. So I think that under those circumstances, we can't give these handouts. And there are other developing countries that have tried to print their way out of trouble and gotten into a lot more trouble. Take this pandemic itself. Among the two worst performing countries in the world are Turkey and Indonesia. And in both those instances, what we've seen, especially in places like Turkey, they have tried to follow some very unorthodox policies and tried to print their way out of trouble. And the entire economic system there is a complete mess.
Right.
So we cannot try and ape what the West is doing in our policy responses and forget the fact that we are still a developing country. So the reforms that we still need to carry out, look at what East Asia did again. I keep going back to that East Asia is a successful model. When East Asia was at a similar stage of economic development as India, with a per capita income of $2,000 or $3,000, they were spending very big on infrastructure. And countries like China, which we think of it as a communist state, in fact, those countries from an economic perspective were very strongly capitalist in the way that they had no welfare spending or very little welfare spending and social spending, because they just wanted to get on with it and focus on building a manufacturing base